Look, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully. If you ever find yourself working as a night security guard at an industrial complex, especially one that handles classified materials, there are rules you need to follow. Rules that might not make sense at first. Rules that might seem paranoid or downright insane. But here's the thing. I used to think the same way. I thought the old-timers were just trying to scare the new guy. I thought I knew better. I was wrong. What happened to me during my 6 months at the Meridian Processing Facility changed everything I thought I knew about the world. And if you're smart, you'll learn from my mistakes before you make them yourself, because some rules aren't just suggestions. Some rules are the only thing standing between you and something that shouldn't exist. My name doesn't matter anymore. Honestly, I'm not even sure if it's the same name I had before all this started. What matters is that I survived. Barely. For 6 months, I worked night security at the Meridian Processing Facility in northern Montana. It's one of those places that doesn't officially exist on any map. Tucked away in a valley so remote that GPS signals get sketchy about 10 miles out. The kind of place where the government does things they don't want anyone asking questions about. I took the job because it paid exceptionally well. Almost suspiciously well for what seemed like simple security work. 12-hour night shifts, 4 days a week, watching over a facility that supposedly processed rare earth minerals for defense contractors. The pay was 3 times what I'd made at my previous security job in Billings, and they offered full benefits after just 30 days. Should have been my first red flag. When I applied, they didn't ask for references from previous employers. They didn't do a standard background check. Instead, they gave me a psychological evaluation that lasted 4 hours and asked some of the strangest questions I'd ever heard. How do you handle isolation? They asked. What's your relationship with authority figures? Have you ever experienced anything you couldn't explain? I answered honestly, thinking I was being clever. I told them I preferred working alone, that I followed rules to the letter, and that I was a rational person who didn't believe in ghost stories or conspiracy theories. They hired me on the spot. Now, before we go any further, I want you to do something for me. I want you to think about the strangest job you've ever had, the workplace rules that made no sense, the procedures that seemed designed more to control employees than actually accomplish anything productive. Drop a comment below and tell me about it, because I guarantee you, whatever weird corporate policies you've encountered don't even come close to what I'm about to tell you. And if this story resonates with you, if you've worked night shifts in places where things just felt off, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe, because there are more stories like this, more places where the rules exist for reasons that go beyond simple corporate liability. My first day started at sunset on a Tuesday in early October. The facility manager, a thin man named Mr. Carver, who looked like he hadn't slept properly in years, met me at the main gate. His handshake felt like touching paper, dry and fragile, like his skin might tear if I gripped too hard. "Welcome to Meridian," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I trust you understand the importance of discretion in this position." I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure what he meant. Every job had confidentiality requirements, especially government contractor work, but there was something in the way he said it. He was talking about more than just keeping quiet about military contracts. The facility itself looked unremarkable from the outside, a collection of concrete buildings surrounded by a double fence topped with razor wire. Security cameras mounted on tall poles swept back and forth in predetermined patterns. Floodlights illuminated every inch of the perimeter. It looked like any other secure government facility, the kind you might drive past on a highway and wonder what they did there. But as we walked through the main gate, I noticed details that didn't quite fit. The cameras weren't just watching the perimeter, they were angled inward, watching the buildings themselves. The floodlights weren't just bright. They had an odd color temperature, almost purple-tinged, that made everything look slightly unreal. And the smell. Even outside, there was a smell in the air that I couldn't identify. Sweet, but with an underlying chemical tang that made my nose burn slightly. "You'll be working alone," Carver explained as he led me toward the main security office. The previous guard finished his contract early, so you'll be the only security personnel on site during night shifts. "What happened to the previous guard?" I asked. Carver stopped walking and turned to look at me. His eyes were bloodshot, with dark circles underneath that spoke of too many sleepless nights. "He completed his assignment," he said carefully. "That's all you need to know." The security office was located in Building A, the largest structure on the complex. It was a windowless concrete cube that housed the main administrative offices during day shifts. My workspace was a small room in the basement, lined with monitors displaying feeds from dozens of security cameras placed throughout the facility. "Your duties are straightforward," Carver said, handing me a thick binder. "Monitor the camera feeds, conduct hourly walking patrols of designated areas, log any unusual activities, report any emergencies immediately." The binder was heavier than I expected. When I opened it, I found pages and pages of rules, procedures, and protocols. But as I flipped through them, I realized these weren't typical security guidelines. Rule 1. Never enter buildings C, D, or E between the hours of 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. without direct authorization from Site Command. Rule 2. If you observe personnel in hazmat suits moving between buildings during night hours, do not approach them. Do not attempt to communicate with them. Log the time and continue your patrol. Rule 3. If the lights in Building F begin flickering in a pattern of 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, immediately evacuate to the parking lot and contact emergency services using the red phone in your vehicle. Rule 4. Do not investigate any sounds coming from the underground levels of any building. Underground access is restricted to authorized personnel only. Rule 5. If you encounter Dr. Elizabeth Chen during night hours, verify her identification immediately. If she cannot produce valid identification, consider her a security threat and follow Code Red protocols. I looked up at Carver, confused. These rules, they seem pretty specific. Has there been problems with security breaches? The rules exist for good reasons, he said. Follow them exactly as written. Don't try to interpret them. Don't try to be creative. Just follow them. But some of these seem... just follow them. His voice had an edge now that made me uncomfortable. The previous guard thought he knew better than the rules. That's why his contract ended early. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever started a job where the training materials made you more confused than informed? Where the safety briefing included scenarios that seemed more like science fiction than workplace hazards? Leave a comment and tell me about the weirdest employee handbook you've ever received, because this was just the beginning of my education at Meridian. Carver continued the orientation by showing me the patrol routes I was expected to follow. Every hour, I was to walk a predetermined path that took me around the exterior of all 6 buildings, then through the main floors of Buildings A and B. Buildings C, D, E, and F were off limits unless specifically instructed otherwise. What's in the restricted buildings? I asked. Processing equipment, he said. Sensitive materials. Nothing that concerns security patrol. But when I looked at the buildings through the fence that separated them from the main complex, I noticed that buildings C and D had no windows at all. Building E had windows, but they were painted black from the inside. Building F looked like it had windows, but as I got closer, I realized they weren't glass. They were some kind of material I'd never seen before, almost like crystalline metal that seemed to shift color depending on the angle you looked at it. "One more thing," Carver said as we returned to the security office. "You'll notice that your radio has multiple channels. No, Channel 1 is for routine communication with Site Command during emergencies. Channel 7 is for special circumstances." "What kind of special circumstances?" "If you have to use Channel 7, you'll know." He handed me the radio, and I noticed that Channel 7's frequency display showed numbers that didn't make sense. They weren't within the normal radio spectrum range. Before he left, Carver gave me one final instruction. "Read the entire procedure manual before your first patrol. All of it. Don't skim. Don't skip sections that seem irrelevant. Every word is there for a reason." I spent my first hour alone in the security office, reading through the manual, and with each page, the job seemed less like routine security work and more like something else entirely. The first few nights were almost disappointingly normal. I monitored the camera feeds, conducted my hourly patrols, and logged routine activities. The facility was quiet, except for the humming of machinery in the restricted buildings, and the occasional vehicle arriving at the loading docks behind Building C. But I started noticing small things that didn't quite add up. The delivery trucks that arrived at night didn't have company logos or license plates. They were unmarked white vehicles that looked like they'd never been through a car wash. The drivers wore coveralls with no identifying patches, and they never spoke to each other that I could see. They would unload cargo containers using a small forklift, disappear into Building C for exactly 27 minutes, then drive away. This happened 3 or 4 times per shift, always between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m., and always with the same precise timing. On my third night, I decided to get a closer look at one of these deliveries. Rule 6 in my manual stated that I should maintain a minimum distance of 50 feet from any delivery operations, but curiosity got the better of me. I was walking my patrol route around the exterior perimeter when I heard the familiar sound of a truck backing up to the loading dock. Instead of continuing my usual path, I cut through a gap between buildings A and B that would give me a better view of the operation. That's when I saw what they were unloading. The cargo containers were standard industrial shipping crates, nothing unusual about them. But when the workers opened them, I could see the contents clearly under the loading dock's bright lights. They weren't unloading equipment or raw materials. They were unloading people. Not workers, people in what looked like hospital gowns, unconscious or sedated, being wheeled into Building C on gurneys. I counted at least 6 individuals from that one truck, all of them appearing to be in some kind of medical restraint system. I stood there, hidden in the shadows between buildings, watching this impossible scene unfold. Every rational part of my mind was trying to find an explanation. Maybe this was some kind of medical research facility. Maybe these were volunteers for clinical trials. Maybe there was a perfectly legal and ethical reason why unconscious people were being delivered to a remote industrial complex at 3 a.m. But deep down, I knew I was witnessing something that wasn't supposed to be seen. The workers finished their unloading in exactly 27 minutes, just like always. They loaded the empty containers back onto the truck, secured the loading dock, and drove away. Within minutes, the area looked like nothing had happened. I completed my patrol, returned to the security office, and sat staring at the logbook. I was supposed to record all the unusual activities, but somehow I didn't think delivery of unconscious people was the kind of unusual activity they wanted me to document. I decided to keep it to myself for the time being. The next morning, as my shift ended and the day security team arrived, I tried to strike up a conversation with my counterpart, a guy named Rodriguez, who'd been working days for about 2 years. "Pretty quiet facility," I said. "Not much happens at night." "That's good," he said. not making eye contact. Quiet is good here. You ever work nights? No. His answer was quick and definitive. Day shift only. That's how I like it. The night deliveries seem pretty routine. Same trucks, same timing. Rodriguez stopped what he was doing and looked at me directly for the first time. Listen, new guy. Piece of advice. Don't ask questions about things that aren't your business. Don't try to figure out what goes on here beyond your specific job duties. Just do your patrols, watch your monitors, and collect your paycheck. I'm just trying to understand. No, you're not. He was packing up his gear with deliberate movements. You're trying to satisfy your curiosity, and curiosity is dangerous here. The last night guard was curious too. What happened to him? Rodriguez paused at the door. He started asking questions, started poking around where he shouldn't have been, started thinking he was some kind of investigative journalist instead of a security guard. And now we need a new night guard. He left without another word. Now I want you to think about this for a moment. Have you ever been in a situation where everyone around you seemed to know something you didn't? Where people gave you warnings without explaining what you were being warned about? Drop a comment below and tell me about a time when you felt like you were walking into something bigger than you understood, because that feeling was about to become very familiar to me. By the end of my first week, I had established a routine. I knew the patrol routes by heart. I had memorized the normal sounds of the facility, the hum of ventilation systems, the rhythmic clicking of industrial equipment, the distant rumble of the underground machinery that I wasn't supposed to investigate. But I had also started noticing anomalies. The camera monitoring Building F would go to static for exactly 3 minutes every night at 2:17 a.m. When the feed returned, sometimes there would be lights visible in windows that had been dark before. The temperature readings from the basement levels of Building D would spike to impossible levels, over 200 degrees Fahrenheit, for brief periods, then return to normal within minutes, and twice during that first week. I had seen Dr. Elizabeth Chen. According to Rule 5, I was supposed to verify her identification if I encountered her during night hours, but both times I saw her, she was on camera feeds, moving through areas that should have been empty. She appeared to be alone, wearing a white lab coat, carrying what looked like medical equipment. The problem was, according to the employee directory in my manual, Dr. Elizabeth Chen had died in a laboratory accident at Meridian 3 years ago. I tried to convince myself that the directory was out of date. Maybe there was another Dr. Chen who had started working there recently. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me in the grainy black and white security footage. But when I zoomed in on the camera feed and got a clear look at her face, I recognized her from the memorial photo in the employee break room. Same person, same face, same everything, except she was supposed to be dead. 2 weeks into my employment at Meridian, I experienced what the manual would later describe as a code yellow scenario. At the time, I had no idea what that meant, but I learned quickly. It started as a normal Tuesday night shift. The usual delivery trucks had come and gone. I had completed my first 3 patrols without incident. The camera feeds were showing normal baseline activity, meaning nothing visible on any of the monitors. At approximately 2:15 a.m., I was in the middle of reviewing the procedural manual, something I had started doing regularly to make sure I wasn't missing anything important, when the lights in Building F began flickering. Not random flickering, the specific pattern mentioned in Rule 3. 3 short. SOS. I watched the pattern repeat 4 times before I remembered what I was supposed to do. According to the rule, I should immediately evacuate to the parking lot and contact emergency services using the red phone in my vehicle. But here's the thing about human nature. When you're faced with a situation that doesn't make logical sense, Your first instinct isn't always to follow instructions. Your first instinct is to try to understand what's happening. The lights in Building Ava weren't just flickering. They were pulsing with an intensity that was almost hypnotic. And as I stared at the building through the security office window, I noticed that the strange crystalline windows seemed to be responding to the light, shifting through colors I couldn't name. Instead of evacuating immediately, I decided to get a closer look. I grabbed my flashlight and radio and headed outside. The night air was unusually cold for October, and there was a stillness that felt wrong. No wind, no insect sounds. Even the constant humming from the other buildings seemed muted. As I approached Building F, the SOS pattern stopped. The building went completely dark except for a soft, pulsing glow from the basement windows. I should have turned around right then. I should have gone back to the security office, grabbed my keys, and driven to the parking lot to make the emergency call. That's what the rules said to do. Instead, I walked up to one of the ground floor windows and tried to peer inside. The crystalline material wasn't transparent like glass. It was more like looking through water that had been frozen mid-ripple. The image was distorted, but I could make out shapes moving inside. Large, mechanical-looking objects that seemed to be rotating or spinning in patterns that defied physics. And there was something else, a sound that I felt more than heard. A deep, rhythmic throbbing that seemed to come from beneath the building. It matched the pulsing glow from the basement windows, and after a few seconds I realized it was also matching my heartbeat. That's when I heard the voice. "Security patrol, please respond." It was coming from my radio, but it wasn't the voice of anyone I'd spoken to before. It was female, calm, and had a slight electronic distortion, like it was being transmitted from very far away. I keyed my radio. "This is Night Security. Who is this?" "Security Patrol. You are not following proper Code Yellow protocols." Code Yellow. I flipped through my mental catalog of the procedural manual, but I couldn't remember reading about any Code Yellow scenarios. I was certain the SOS light pattern was classified as something else. "I need clarification on Code Yellow protocols," I said into the radio. "Evacuate to parking lot. Use red phone. Do not approach Building F during active phase." "What's active phase?" The radio went silent. I stood there for another few seconds, watching the pulsing glow from the basement windows. The mechanical shapes inside seemed to be moving faster now, and the throbbing sound was getting stronger, strong enough that I could feel it in my chest, like standing too close to massive speakers at a concert. That's when I noticed that the glow wasn't just coming from the basement windows anymore. It was coming from underneath the building, seeping up through cracks in the concrete foundation. The light had a color that I'd never seen before. Not quite blue, not quite purple, but something that seemed to exist in a spectrum beyond normal visible light. And that's when I saw her. Dr. Elizabeth Chen was standing about 20 feet away from me, next to the corner of Building F. She was wearing the same white lab coat I'd seen in the security footage. But now I could see her clearly in person. She looked exactly like the memorial photo, except her skin had a pale, almost translucent quality that made her appear to be lit from within. She was staring directly at me. "You shouldn't be here," she said. Her voice was soft, but carried clearly across the distance between us, despite the growing sound from beneath the building. "Dr. Chen," I said, reaching for my radio to follow Rule 5 protocols. "Don't," she said, holding up a hand. "Radio contact will only make it worse." "Make what worse?" She pointed to the ground beneath Building F. The concrete was beginning to crack in radiating patterns, like a spider web spreading outward from the center of the building. The strange light was getting brighter, seeping through the cracks with increasing intensity. "The containment system is failing," she said. "That's what the lights were trying to tell you. SOS, save our souls." "I don't understand." What's being contained? Dr. Chen started walking toward me, and as she got closer, I could see that she wasn't quite solid. Her edges seemed to blur and shift, like she was made of smoke that had been shaped into human form, something that should never have been brought to the surface, she said. Something that should have stayed buried in the deep places where it belongs. The throbbing sound suddenly intensified, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The air around Building F shimmered like heat waves, but the temperature was dropping rapidly. I could see my breath now, crystallizing in the air. "Listen to me very carefully," Dr. Chun said, her voice urgent. "You need to get to the red phone and call the emergency number, but don't tell them about code yellow. Tell them code black. Tell them the Meridian incident is happening again." "What's the Meridian incident?" "The reason I'm dead," she said simply. The cracks in the concrete were spreading faster now, reaching toward where I was standing. Where the light touched the ground, the asphalt began to bubble and melt like it was being heated from below. "Go," Dr. Chen said. "Run. Don't look back, and don't try to help anyone else you might see. Some of them aren't really people anymore." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran toward the parking lot, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I sprinted across the compound. Behind me, I could hear the sound of concrete cracking and what sounded like metal screaming under tremendous stress. When I reached my security vehicle, I fumbled for the keys with shaking hands. The red phone was mounted on the dashboard, a direct line that I had been told was only for the most extreme emergencies. I picked up the handset and immediately heard a dial tone, followed by an automated message. "Emergency protocols activated. State the nature of your emergency." "This is Meridian Night Security," I said, my voice cracking. "We have a code black situation. The Meridian incident is happening again." There was a pause. Then a different voice came on the line, male, authoritative, wide awake despite the early morning hour. "Confirm. Code black at Meridian Processing Facility. Confirmed. Building F is... Something's wrong with Building F. The containment system is failing. Roger. Initiate immediate lockdown protocols. Do not leave your vehicle. Do not approach any personnel on foot. Emergency response teams are en route. ETA 12 minutes. The line went dead. I sat in my vehicle, engine running, watching Building F through the windshield. The strange light was now visible from half a mile away, casting everything in that impossible color that hurt to look at directly. The building itself seemed to be vibrating, and I could see cracks spreading across its walls like lightning bolts frozen in concrete. Now here's something I want you to think about. Have you ever been in a situation where you realized that everything you thought you knew about your job, your workplace, or your life was completely wrong? Where reality shifted so dramatically that you questioned your own sanity? Let me know in the comments, because what happened next challenged every assumption I'd ever made about the nature of reality itself. Emergency vehicles started arriving exactly 12 minutes later. But these weren't normal emergency vehicles. They were unmarked black trucks with no windows, followed by what looked like military transports. Personnel in full hazmat suits deployed from the vehicles and immediately set up a perimeter around Building F. I watched through my windshield as they worked with practiced efficiency, like they'd done this before. They set up some kind of equipment that looked like a cross between radar dishes and industrial air conditioners, all pointed toward the failing building. Within minutes, they had established what appeared to be a containment field, a shimmering barrier of distorted air that surrounded Building F completely. One of the hazmat-suited figures approached my vehicle and tapped on the window. When I rolled it down, a metallic voice spoke from behind the reflective face shield. "Security personnel, you are to remain in your vehicle until decontamination procedures are complete. Do not exit. Do not remove any equipment from the vehicle. Do not discuss what you have observed with anyone not directly involved in emergency response." "What's happening?" I asked. "Routine containment maintenance," the figure said. "Nothing more." But I could see past the official response. Through the shimmering containment field, Building F was collapsing in on itself, not falling down like a controlled demolition. Collapsing inward, like space itself was folding around it. The impossible light was being drawn into the center of the building, creating a spiral pattern that made my eyes water to look at. And in the midst of all this controlled chaos, I saw Dr. Elizabeth Chen one more time. She was standing just outside the containment field, still in her white lab coat, still translucent and flickering. She was looking directly at me through the windshield of my vehicle, and I could see her lips moving. She was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't hear her over the sound of the emergency equipment. Then she pointed. Not at Building F, not at the emergency crews, but at Building C, the building where I'd seen the unconscious people being delivered. That's when I understood. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened at Meridian, and whatever was being delivered to Building C in those unmarked trucks wasn't just people. It was fuel, or food, or some kind of offering to keep whatever lived beneath Building F contained and satisfied. Dr. Elizabeth Chen had figured that out 3 years ago, and it had gotten her killed. Now she was trying to warn me about what came next. The emergency response lasted until dawn. By the time my shift officially ended, Building F had been completely renovated, according to the official report that was placed on my desk the next evening. The new structure looked identical to the old one from the outside, but something about it felt different, more solid, more permanent, like it had been built to contain something that would never be allowed to escape again. When I came in for my next shift, Mr. Carver was waiting for me in the security office. He looked even more exhausted than usual, if that was possible, and there were stress lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. "I understand you experienced some unusual activity last night," he said without preamble. "The emergency response was very thorough," I replied carefully. "Good. I'm glad you followed protocols." He handed me a new version of the procedural manual, thicker than the previous one, with several additional sections. "Some of our procedures have been updated based on recent events." I flipped through the new manual and found an entire chapter dedicated to code black scenarios that hadn't existed before. The level of detail was disturbing. Specific evacuation routes for different types of containment failures, communication protocols for non-standard personnel encounters, and medical procedures for reality exposure incidents. "Mr. Carver," I said, "what exactly does this facility process?" He was quiet for a long time, staring at the bank of security monitors. Finally, he said, "Things that exist in the spaces between what people think is possible and what actually is possible. Things that were never meant to exist in our reality, but somehow do. And my job is to keep them contained." "Your job is to follow the rules," he corrected. "The containment is handled by specialists. You're here to make sure nothing interferes with their work." "What happened to Dr. Chen?" Another long pause. "Dr. Chen tried to document something that can't be documented. She tried to study something that becomes more dangerous the more you understand it. She thought scientific method and rational analysis could be applied to phenomena that exist outside the boundaries of rational thought. And it killed her?" "No," Carver said quietly. "It did something worse than kill her. It made her part of the problem she was trying to solve." I thought about the translucent figure I'd seen, the woman who was trying to warn me about dangers she could no longer directly interfere with. "She's still here, isn't she?" "Dr. Chen is a security asset now," Carver said. "Her consciousness exists in a state that allows her to monitor areas and situations that our regular surveillance equipment can't properly observe. She's part of the early warning system. That's insane. Insane is a meaningless word here, Carver replied. Sane and insane are human concepts that apply to human experiences. What we deal with at Meridian operates under different rules. He stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the facility grounds. In daylight, everything looked normal again. Workers in regular clothes were moving between buildings, carrying clipboards and tablets like employees at any other industrial complex. The people you saw being delivered to Building C, Carver continued, apparently reading my thoughts, are volunteers. Volunteers for what? To provide what we call reality anchors. The entities we contain here exist in a state of flux between dimensions. They need stable human consciousness to maintain coherent form in our reality. Without regular malfeeding, they become unstable and begin to affect the physical laws around them. I felt sick. You're feeding people to monsters. We're providing necessary resources to maintain critical containment systems, he said clinically. The volunteers are people who were already dying. Terminal cancer patients, end-stage organ failure, severe brain trauma. People who have weeks or days left under normal circumstances. We offer them the opportunity to serve a greater purpose by becoming food for things that shouldn't exist, by becoming part of a containment system that prevents those things from affecting millions of other people, Carver said. The entities contained here have the potential to alter reality on a continental scale if they're not properly managed. The sacrifice of a few dozen terminally ill volunteers each month prevents a catastrophe that could affect every living person in North America. I stared at him, trying to process what I was hearing. It was like being told that everything I understood about the world was not only wrong, but dangerously naive. How many facilities like this are there? I asked. Enough, he said, scattered around the world, in places remote enough that containment failures won't immediately affect major population centers. Each one handles different types of anomalies. And you think this is justified? Carver turned away from the window and looked at me directly. I think it's necessary, he said, and I think you'll come to understand that necessity if you stay here long enough. He left me alone with the new manual and my thoughts. I spent the next several hours reading through the updated procedures, and with each page, the scope of what I'd gotten involved with became clearer. Meridian wasn't just a containment facility. It was one node in a global network of sites dedicated to managing what the manual referred to as reality intrusions, the phenomena that violated the basic laws of physics and threatened the stability of normal existence. The entities contained in buildings C, D, E, and F weren't aliens or monsters in any traditional sense. They were fragments of alternate realities that had somehow broken through into our dimension, bringing their own laws of physics with them. Left uncontained, they would gradually spread their alternate reality outward, like an infection, changing everything they touched until vast areas of our world operated under completely different physical and logical rules. Think about that for a moment. Imagine if gravity worked differently in your hometown. Imagine if cause and effect became optional, or if the passage of time became inconsistent. Imagine trying to live a normal life in a place where the fundamental assumptions of reality changed from day to day. That's what would happen if facilities like Meridian didn't exist. But the cost of containment was regular sacrifice. The entities required human consciousness to maintain stable form, which meant a constant supply of people who were willing or convinced to give up their lives to become part of the containment system. And once someone became part of the system, they didn't exactly die. They became something else, aware but not alive in any meaningful sense, like Dr. Elizabeth Chen, wandering the facility in a translucent form, unable to directly interfere but able to observe and occasionally warn. I want to pause here and ask you something. If you knew that a small number of people had to die horrible deaths to prevent a catastrophe that would affect millions, would you consider that acceptable? Would you be able to work in a place like Meridian, knowing what the cost was? Leave a comment and let me know, because this is the moral question I was forced to confront every single night I worked there. As I continued reading the manual, I found references to other sites in the network, facilities built into abandoned mine shafts in Colorado that contained temporal anomalies, underground complexes in Nevada that housed probability distortions, research stations in Antarctica that monitored dimensional stability. Meridian was just one small part of a vast, secret infrastructure designed to keep reality functional for the rest of humanity. And my job was to make sure that the people who managed this system could do their work without interference. 3 weeks after the Building F incident, I decided I needed to know more about the volunteers. The official explanation Carver had given me felt incomplete, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there were aspects of the operation that were being kept from me. So I started paying closer attention to the delivery trucks. Each truck brought between 4 and 8 people, always during the early morning hours, when I was the only security personnel on duty. The timing was too consistent to be coincidental. They were deliberately scheduling deliveries when there would be minimal witnesses. I started keeping my own log of the deliveries, separate from the official security reports, truck arrivals, number of individuals unloaded, duration of unloading process, any identifying features I could observe from a distance. What I found was disturbing. The people being delivered weren't all obviously terminal patients. Some of them appeared to be young and healthy. Some were clearly sedated, but others seemed to be conscious and aware of their surroundings. A few appeared to be struggling against their restraints. These didn't look like volunteers making a noble sacrifice for the greater good. These looked like victims. On a Thursday night in early November, I decided to get a closer look at one of the deliveries. I knew it was against regulations, but I needed to understand what was really happening. At 2:30 a.m., I heard the familiar sound of a truck backing up to the loading dock behind Building C. Instead of staying at my designated observation distance, I circled around to the opposite side of the building, where there was a service corridor that would give me a better view. The unloading process was already underway when I got into position. 2 workers in unmarked coveralls were wheeling gurneys from the truck into Building C. But this time, I was close enough to see the faces of the people being transported. The first person was an elderly man who appeared to be unconscious, consistent with what I'd been told about terminal patients. But the second was a woman who couldn't have been more than 30 years old. Her eyes were open, and she was looking around frantically, clearly aware of what was happening to her. When she saw the workers, she tried to speak, but there was tape over her mouth. The third person made me question everything I'd been told about this operation. It was a teenage boy, maybe 16 or 17 years old. He was awake, alert, and fighting against the restraints holding him to the gurney. He wasn't sedated, and he definitely wasn't dying from any terminal illness. When one of the workers adjusted his restraints, the boy managed to turn his head in my direction. Our eyes met for just a second. But in that moment, I saw pure terror. This wasn't someone who had volunteered for anything. This was someone who had been taken against their will. I watched in horror as 6 more people were unloaded from the truck. Only 2 of them appeared to be the terminal patients that Carver had described. The others were young, healthy, and clearly unwilling participants in whatever was happening inside Building C. When the truck left, I stayed hidden in the service corridor, trying to process what I'd witnessed. Everything I'd been told about the volunteer program was a lie. These people weren't making noble sacrifices for the greater good. They were being kidnapped and fed to whatever entities lived beneath the Meridian facility. But as disturbing as that realization was, what happened next was worse. About 20 minutes after the delivery truck left, I heard voices coming from inside Building C. Not the voices of the workers, different voices, speaking in what sounded like multiple languages simultaneously. The voices were coming from the basement level, transmitted through ventilation grates that opened near where I was hiding. As I listened, I began to recognize some of the voices. One of them belonged to the elderly man from the truck. Another was the young woman who had been looking around in terror. But they weren't speaking like frightened victims anymore. They were speaking in unison, like parts of a larger consciousness. "New anchors are stable," they said together. "Containment integrity restored. Reality distortion decreased to acceptable parameters. Integration proceeding normally," said another voice, the teenage boy. "Consciousness merge complete. Individual identity dissolved. We remember being afraid," said the woman's voice. "Oh, we remember wanting to live. But those were individual concerns. We understand the greater purpose now." I felt sick listening to this. Whatever process was happening inside Building C wasn't just killing these people. It was absorbing them into some kind of collective consciousness that served the containment system. They were becoming part of the entities they were supposed to be feeding. "New awareness detected," said one of the voices suddenly. All conversation stopped. "Security personnel in unauthorized location," said another voice. "Individual consciousness not integrated. Potential security risk." I realized with growing horror that they were talking about me. Whatever these merged consciousnesses were, they could sense my presence. "Should be reported to management," said the teenage boy's voice. "Protocol violation requires correction." "No," said a familiar voice. Dr. Elizabeth Chen. "This one is learning. Learning serves the greater stability." "Dr. Chen consciousness is not fully integrated," said another voice. "Her recommendations lack full authority." "My recommendations carry the authority of experience," Chen's voice replied. "I remember the consequences of forced learning. Gradual understanding produces better security personnel." There was a long pause. Then the collective voices spoke in unison. "Acceptable. Security personnel will be monitored. Natural progression preferred to forced integration." I didn't wait to hear more. I crept away from the service corridor as quietly as possible and returned to the security office, where I sat staring at the monitors and trying to make sense of what I'd heard. The volunteers weren't being killed. They were being absorbed into a collective consciousness that helped maintain the containment systems. Their individual identities were dissolved, but their awareness continued as part of something larger and more alien than anything I'd imagined. And Dr. Elizabeth Chen was part of this collective, but somehow maintaining enough individual identity to act independently. She was protecting me from being reported to management. But why? Over the next few hours, I reviewed everything I knew about the facility with this new understanding. The entities contained beneath Meridian weren't separate from the people being delivered. They were composed of those people. Every delivery added new consciousness to the collective, making it more stable and better able to maintain containment of whatever reality distortions existed at the site. The people working at Meridian during day shifts weren't just employees. They were potential future additions to the collective. Everyone who worked there long enough would eventually become part of the system they were helping to maintain, including me. Now let me ask you something, and I really want you to think about this carefully. If you discovered that your workplace was essentially a machine that consumed human consciousness to prevent a global catastrophe, what would you do? Would you quit and risk whatever consequences that might bring? Would you stay and try to work within the system? Would you try to expose what was happening knowing that doing so might cause the very catastrophe the system was designed to prevent. Leave a comment with your thoughts, because this is the impossible choice I was facing. I had 3 options. I could quit and hope that whatever non-disclosure agreements I'd signed would protect me from retaliation. I could stay and gradually become part of the collective consciousness that managed containment, or I could try to expose Meridian and risk causing a reality distortion event that could affect millions of people. None of these options felt acceptable, but as I sat in the security office that night, watching the monitors and listening to the ambient sounds of the facility, I realized there might be a 4th option. If Dr. Chen had maintained enough individual identity to act independently within the collective, maybe there was a way to work within the system without losing myself completely. Maybe I could find a way to change things from the inside. It was a long shot, but it was better than accepting that either I had to become a monster or allow monsters to continue operating unchecked. I decided to start by trying to communicate with Dr. Chen directly, attempting to establish direct contact with Dr. Elizabeth. Chen proved more complicated than I had anticipated. She appeared on security cameras regularly, but always in areas where I couldn't physically reach her during my patrol routes. She seemed to exist primarily in the restricted sections of the facility, the areas where living personnel weren't allowed without special authorization. But after the incident in the service corridor, I noticed changes in her behavior. She started appearing in locations where she could see me directly, rather than just on camera feeds. She would stand at windows of restricted buildings when I was conducting exterior patrols, or appear in corridors just at the edge of my flashlight beam during interior sweeps. She was trying to get my attention without violating whatever constraints governed her existence. On the first Friday of December, I decided to test whether direct communication was possible. During my 3 a.m. patrol of Building A, I noticed Dr. Chen standing at the end of a hallway that led to the restricted basement levels. She was clearer than I'd ever seen her, almost solid, with only a slight translucent quality around her edges. I approached as close as I dared to the basement access door and spoke quietly. "Dr. Chen, I know you can hear me. I know you've been protecting me from the collective. I need to understand what's really happening here." She raised one hand and pointed to a maintenance closet about 20 feet down the hallway. Then she walked through the basement access door and disappeared. I found the maintenance closet unlocked. Inside, wedged behind a panel of cleaning supplies, was a small digital recorder. When I pressed play, I heard Dr. Chen's voice. Not the electronic distortion from my radio, but her actual voice, recorded when she was still alive. "If you're hearing this, it means the security protocols have been modified to allow gradual revelation rather than forced integration. That's progress, I suppose. My name is Dr. Elizabeth Chen, and I was the lead researcher on Project Meridian from 2018 until my death in 2021. The recording paused, then continued. What I'm about to tell you will seem impossible, but you've already seen enough to know that impossible isn't a meaningful concept here. The entities we contain at this facility are not from another planet or dimension. They are from another version of reality, a reality where the fundamental laws of physics developed differently. Imagine if during the early formation of the universe, the constants that govern how matter and energy interact had been slightly different. Gravity might work in reverse. Time might flow backwards. Cause and effect might be optional rather than mandatory. That's the reality these entities come from. 3 years ago, we made contact with this alternate reality through experimental quantum field manipulation. The contact was supposed to last for microseconds. It lasted for 17 hours. During those 17 hours, fragments of the alternate reality began seeping into our dimension, bringing their physics with them. The area around the contact point became what we call a reality distortion zone, a place where the normal laws of our universe were being overwritten by the laws of their universe. The only way to stop the spread was to create what we call consciousness anchors, stable human minds that could maintain our version of reality through focused mental effort. But the process of becoming an anchor requires the complete dissolution of individual identity. The person dies, but their consciousness becomes part of a collective mind that enforces our physical laws within the distortion zone. I paused the recording, my hands shaking. What Dr. Chen was describing was even worse than what I'd imagined. The people being delivered to Building C weren't being fed to monsters. They were being dissolved into a collective consciousness that literally held reality together through pure mental force. I pressed play again. The collective consciousness that maintains containment is not malevolent, but it is no longer human in any meaningful sense. It thinks in terms of statistical probabilities and acceptable losses. Individual human lives are just variables in an equation designed to prevent universal catastrophe. I became part of this collective. When I attempted to document the process from the inside, I volunteered to undergo consciousness dissolution, thinking that I could maintain my scientific objectivity and study the phenomenon from within. I was wrong. The process changed me in ways I didn't anticipate. However, my scientific training gave me certain advantages. I retained more individual identity than most anchors, which allows me to act independently within certain constraints. I can observe, I can warn, and I can occasionally interfere with the collection process, but I cannot directly prevent the system from operating. If you're hearing this recording, it means you've been selected as a potential new security asset. Not security for the facility, security for the collective consciousness itself. Your job is to identify individuals who might be suitable anchors and ensure that the collection process operates smoothly. Eventually, if you stay here long enough, you will be offered the choice to join the collective voluntarily. Most long-term employees accept this offer. The alternative is to leave Meridian and spend the rest of your life knowing that reality itself depends on a system of organized human sacrifice. The recording ended, and I sat in the maintenance closet, holding the device and trying to process what I'd learned. Everything I'd been told about Meridian was simultaneously true and completely misleading. Yes, they were preventing a global catastrophe. Yes, the volunteer program was saving millions of lives. But the cost was the systematic dissolution of human consciousness on an industrial scale, and I was being groomed to help identify future victims. Over the next several hours, I noticed Dr. Chen appearing more frequently on the security monitors. She seemed to be monitoring my emotional state, waiting to see how I would react to the truth. Finally, during my 5 a.m. patrol, she appeared directly in front of me in the main corridor of Building A. This time, she was solid enough that I could see her clearly in the overhead lighting. "You understand now," she said. It wasn't a question. "I understand that everything about this job is a lie," I replied. "No," she said. "Everything about this job is true. It's just more complicated than you were initially told." "You call systematic murder complicated? I call it necessary," she said. "And that's the hardest part of what you're learning. The system is horrible, but it's also essential. Without the consciousness anchors, the reality distortion would spread outward at approximately 50 miles per month. Within 10 years, the entire North American continent would exist under altered physical laws. And you think that justifies kidnapping people?" Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment, her translucent form flickering like she was struggling to maintain cohesion. "I think," she said finally, "that the universe doesn't care what we think is justified. The universe only cares what works. And this works. There has to be another way." I spent 3 years looking for another way, she said. I died looking for another way. The collective has spent decades looking for another way. If there was another way, don't you think we would have found it by now? I didn't have an answer for that. The question, Dr. Chen continued, is what you're going to do with this knowledge. You can quit, but that won't change anything, except that someone else will take your job. You can try to expose the facility, but that will just force them to relocate and find new staff. Or you can stay and try to make the system more humane from within. How is any of this humane? The people who are brought here are already dying, she said. Terminal cancer patients who have weeks left, accident victims who will never wake up from comas, people in irreversible vegetative states. We're not taking healthy people off the street. We're offering a purpose to people who have no other future. I saw healthy people being delivered, young people, people who were fighting their restraints. Dr. Chen's form flickered more intensely, like she was struggling with some internal conflict. Yes, she said finally, sometimes the collection process expands beyond its original parameters. The collective consciousness doesn't always distinguish between terminally ill volunteers and other potential anchors. That's why security personnel like you are important. You can help ensure that the system operates within ethical boundaries by reporting people who aren't suitable for collection, by identifying people who are suitable for collection, she corrected, by helping the collective understand the difference between willing volunteers and unwilling victims. It was the choice she'd been leading me toward all along. I could become complicit in the system, but potentially make it less monstrous. Or I could walk away and let it continue operating without any human oversight. Now, I want you to think about this, because this is the kind of moral decision that most people never have to face. If you could make a terrible system slightly less terrible, but only by becoming part of that system, would you do it? If your participation might save some lives, even while contributing to the loss of other lives, is that a choice you could live with? Comment below and tell me what you think, because I had to make this decision with incomplete information and no guarantee that my involvement would actually help anyone. In the end, I made the only choice that felt remotely acceptable. I agreed to stay. The transition from naive security guard to active participant in the Meridian system was gradual, but irreversible. It began with small compromises that seemed reasonable at the time, then escalated to actions I never thought I would be capable of. Dr. Chen became my guide through this process, appearing regularly during my shifts to provide context and justification for each new level of involvement. She had an uncanny ability to present the most horrific aspects of the operation as necessary evils, and I found myself accepting her arguments more readily than I should have. The first active role I played was in the evaluation of potential volunteers. Mr. Carver began providing me with files on individuals who were being considered for the program. Detailed medical records, psychological profiles, family situations. My job was to review these files and provide recommendations about suitability. The files were heartbreaking. Terminal cancer patients who were facing months of agony, accident victims who would never regain consciousness, people with degenerative neurological conditions who were slowly losing everything that made them human. Initially, all of the candidates seemed to fit the profile Carver had described. People who were genuinely dying and might find meaning in contributing to something larger than themselves. I felt comfortable recommending individuals who appeared to have no other options and whose families had already begun the process of letting go. But gradually, the files began including people with less clear-cut situations, early-stage cancer patients who might have years left with treatment, coma patients who showed signs of possible recovery, people with disabilities who were living meaningful lives despite their conditions. When I questioned these recommendations, Dr. Chen would appear to provide context. The collective's need for consciousness anchors is growing, she explained. The reality distortion is expanding despite our efforts. We need stronger minds, more diverse perspectives, more stable personalities. The terminally ill don't always provide the mental resilience required for long-term anchor duty. But these people could have full lives ahead of them. Could, she emphasized. But will they? The early-stage cancer patient has a 30% 5-year survival rate. The coma patient has shown minimal brain activity for 6 months. The disabled individual requires constant care and has expressed suicidal thoughts to their therapist. These aren't healthy people being taken in their prime. These are people facing uncertain futures who can serve a certain purpose. The rationalizations became easier to accept over time. I started seeing the files differently, looking for reasons to approve candidates rather than reasons to reject them. I told myself I was helping people find meaning in difficult circumstances. The next phase of my involvement was direct recruitment. Carver assigned